Using rough cut cedar from our property, I jointed all the edges of the boards, planed them down to an equal thickness of about 1/2 inch, cut them to length, and cut them to width. I have all of the panels cut out now, and they're varying widths because that's what I've got. Working with wood from our property means I don't always have dimensional lumber that you might get from the store, so I'm not working in fixed widths. I'm working with whatever I've got that had usable pieces of wood to them. So now that I have those cut out, I want to make sure that I have a pleasing layout to each side. Some of the boards are this width, some are much wider, and if I put all the wide ones on one side and all the narrow ones on another, not as pleasing. So I've also laid out my panels with the sapwood facing to the outsides from center of each of the panels. So rather than putting everything like this with the sapwood facing the same direction, like a tree, sapwood to the outside. I've also set some of the boards to the outside that have knots because those won't have to be joined. I don't need to do a tongue and groove. You'll also notice that I've gone beyond what I need for the width. This is because I'll be using a tongue and groove, and that'll shorten up the effective width of each of my boards. I have my panels laid out, and I've numbered all the ends in sequence so that I know exactly how they're supposed to go together and which side is going to be tongued and which side will have the groove on it. I'll be putting the tongue and groove on with my Veritas plow plane, and because my boards are 1/2 inch thick or about 12 millimeters, I'll be dividing by 3, gives you about 4. I have a 4 millimeter tonguing bit, and I'll be using the 4 millimeter groove as well. As with anything in woodworking, with practice comes better technique, more efficiency, and a better control of the tools you're using. What I discovered with this small plow plane is that, like with other planes, waxing the sole helps it glide across the material a little bit better. Second thing is, my first inclination was to grab it by the handle and force it through that way. I discovered that it's much better rather than grabbing it by the handle, I kind of cup the plane in my hand, using this as a guide forward rather than using this to force it forward. It keeps my cut a lot straighter. Let's watch. I'll start by planing off the top surface to make sure it's nice and smooth. First few passes, I'm going to start in the middle rather than at the end of the board. That allows me to set the groove that the plane will follow in. I'm not doing a lot of downward pressure, just forward at this time and cupping it against the board. It's a bit of a knot back here, so I'll go in front of that. Especially when I come to these knots, it's important to have the sole a little bit waxed that goes against it. It helps it slide much, much easier on there. And what's keeping the depth from going too far is this little bump in here that sets the depth. I can actually set it much shallower if I wish. So it takes about 30 seconds to do one little board. Setting up the plow plane for the groove is similar. This is my depth stop. And to set the depth, I want to put the gap just a little bit more than the depth of the tongue, so I have a slight gap between those to allow for the expansion as this wood may swell, especially as it's in the outdoor humid environment. It's also important to remember to use the same side. You can tell that my groove is not quite centered, or my tongue is not quite centered on the boards. The one side is a little bit shallower than the other. So I need to make sure that I keep the same side up at all times. The cedar moisture content comes in at about 7.5%. It's going to be quite a change when it gets exposed to the outdoor elements of our Pacific Northwest rainforest. So to compensate for that, in my layout, I've allowed for a spacing of 2 pennies between each of the slats. That'll allow it to swell as the wood takes up some of that moisture content. With the pennies in place and the panels clamped together, no glue, I'll take my top piece and take a look at the length that I need. And the overage, which comes in at 1¼ inches, I'll divide by 2 and take that amount off of each end of this panel. That way it'll fit into the groove that I've got. I have these small feet that I'm going to be adding to the bottoms of each of the legs. That'll be just enough to keep it up off the deck in rainy weather. They're about 1/4 inch thick. I'll just center those at the bottom of each leg. With this nail-free build, the front piece and the back piece come together first, with the through tenon and the top side pieces locking everything into place. In order to lay this out, first I need to know where the outside of this leg is going to come. My leg is square, so I can just lay this on top of here, butt it up to the wall, and mark it with a knife where that center is going to come. And my knife marking is right here. I'll place this in equidistant, but when I set the punch, I don't want to set it right on the line. I want to pull it back in a little bit so that the wedge actually draws against the leg. Only by maybe 1/16 of an inch is sufficient of a gap. You do need to have something rather than having it exactly flush with the leg, because flush won't pull it as tight. Actually, I'm just going to mark this as the back side. That's going to be very front side. I'll about here to here. So, like this far in, I've got the back side. The front side will be about like this when it's done. So, you can see the angle that I need to hold this at. The tusks or keys I'll be cutting out of some scrap mahogany that I have. First I'll take it down to a thickness of 5/16 to match my mortises. Then I'll cut the angle on the stock for each of the keys. I'll be using about a 5-degree angle that gives a good solid grip as it enters into the mortise to hold things in place and tight. I had some 11-inch wide boards for the sills, so I cut them in half. The front and back are cut to a length to fit between the rafter tails. The sides are cut to fill their gap, plus the length needed for the tenons on each end. All of the edges are planed down to remove saw marks and any unevenness. I rounded over the bottom outside edges with a plane to match the rafter tails, but I left the insides flat for joinery work. I sanded the ends to match the profile of the rafter tail. A rasp would also do the trick. I'll be putting 1-inch deep mortises into the front and back sill boards, 2 of them for each of the side boards. I'm using a 1/4-inch bit, and I'll set that depth. I'll do that on the pen router. I want a 1-inch deep, so I'll go 1 1/8 inch deep. For the double tenons, I'm still using the same template set as they were. And the guide says for a 1/2-inch bit, I'll be using the 10mm follower. I've set my depth to 1 inch. For the tenon length, I want to make sure I have it exactly to fit. So I've laid this in place. I'll push these out, and I'll mark the underside right up against the other board where the length of the tenon should come. That way I'll have it perfect dead on. And I'm bringing the bit just up to that point, and then I'll set the depth for the pen router according to where the bit rests.